And that's not always easy to answer, because sometimes they don't always make their deepest or most fundamental questions altogether clear. In the case of Leviathan, I would suggest to you, Hobbes' central question is, what makes authority possible? What is the source of authority? And you might say, what renders it legitimate? Maybe the question is, what makes legitimate authority possible? This is still a huge question for us when we think about nation building and building new states, how to create a legitimate authority. Obviously, there's a tremendous issue with this in Iraq today. As people there and here struggle with what would constitute a legitimate authority. Perhaps we should airlift copies of Leviathan to them, because that's the issue that Hobbes is fundamentally concerned with. His question goes further. How can individuals who are biologically autonomous, who judge and see matters very differently from one another, who can never be sure whether they trust one another, how can such individuals accept a common authority? And again, that is not just what constitutes authority, but what makes authority legitimate. That remains not only the fundamental question for Hobbes, but for the entire, at least for the entire social contract tradition that he helped to establish. You might say, of course, the question, what renders authority legitimate, is only possible or is only raised when authority is in question. That is to say, when the rules governing authority have broken down in times of crisis. And that was certainly true in Hobbes' time, a time of civil war and crisis. What renders authority legitimate or respectable? And to answer that question, Hobbes tells a story. He tells a story about something he calls the state of nature, a term he did not invent, but with which his name will always and forever be associated, the idea of the state of nature. The state of nature is not a gift of grace or a state of grace from which we have fallen, as in the biblical account of Eden, nor is the state of nature a political condition as maintained in some sense by Aristotle when he says the polis is by nature. The state of nature for Hobbes is a condition of conflict and war. And by a state of nature, he means, or by a state of war, he means a condition where there is no recognized authority, in his language, to keep us in awe. No authority to awe us. Such a condition, a state of war, may mean a condition of open warfare, but not necessarily. It can signify battle, but Hobbes says it can also signify the will to contend, simply the desire or the will to engage in conflict renders something like a state of nature. A state of war can include, in other words, what we might call a Cold War. Two hostile sides looking at each other across a barrier of some type, not clear or not certain what the other will do. So the state of nature is not necessarily a condition of actual fighting, but what he calls a known disposition to fight. If you are known or believed to be willing to fight, you're in a state of war. It is a condition for Hobbes of maximum security, where in his famous formula, life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Perhaps he should have said, fortunately short. This is the natural condition, the state of nature, the state of war that Hobbes attributes to, again, the fundamental fact of human nature. Now, his claim that the state of nature is the condition that we are the state of war, rather, is a condition that we are naturally in, is to say, among other things, that nature does not unite us in peace, in harmony, in friendship, or in solidarity. If nature is a norm, it does not, again, mandate or incline us to peace, friendship, and solidarity with others. Only human art or science or art, human contrivance can bring about peace. Conflict and war are primary. Peace is derivative. In other words, for Hobbes, authority and relations of authority do not arise naturally among us, but are rather, again, like civil science itself, the product of contrivance or art. So the question for us remains, as it was deeply challenged readers in Hobbes' own time, what makes Hobbes' story, as I'm calling it, his story about the state of nature being a condition of war, what makes it plausible? What makes it believable as an account of, again, the condition we are naturally in? Why should we believe Hobbes' story and not some other story? I just want to say a word about that before closing. From one point of view, reading Hobbes, his account of the state of nature seems to derive from his physics of motion and rest in the opening chapters of Leviathan. He begins the work, you remember, with an account of human nature, account of human psychology, as a product of sense and experience. We are bodies in motion, and who cannot help but obey the law or the physics of attraction and repulsion. We are bodies in constant motion. He seems, in other words, to have a kind of materialistic psychology in which human behavior exhibits the same, as it were, mechanical tendencies as billiard balls that can be understood as obeying, again, geometric or causal processes of cause and effect, right? The state of nature is not seen by him as an actual historical condition in some ways, although he occasionally will refer to what we might think of as anthropological evidence to support his views in the state of nature. But the state of nature for him is rather a kind of thought experiment after the manner of experimental science. It is a kind of thought experiment. It consists of taking human beings who are members of families, of estates, of kingdoms, and so on, dissolving these social relations into their fundamental units, namely the abstract individuals, and then imagining, again, in the manner of a chemist or a physicist, how these basic units would hypothetically interact with one another, again, almost like the properties of chemical substances in some ways. How would we behave in this, again, this kind of thought experiment? That would be one way of reading, or that Hobbes seems to want us to think about the state of nature as again as akin to a scientific experiment. Hobbes is the great founder of what we might call among others, is the experimental method in social and political science. And there's perhaps a reason for this too. And I'll end just on this note. When Hobbes was a young man, he worked as a private secretary for a short time, private secretary to another very famous Englishman by the name of Francis Bacon, the great founder of what we think of as the experimental method, the method of trial and error, of experience and experiment. And it arguably, Hobbes was influenced in many ways by Bacon's own philosophy of experience and experiment. And Hobbes took Bacon's method in some ways, applying it to politics, tried to imagine, again, the natural condition of human beings, and what we are by nature, by a process of abstraction, and abstracting all of the relations and properties that we have acquired over history, through custom, through experience, stripping those away like the layers of an onion, and putting us almost, as it were, in an experimental test tube or under a microscope, seeing how we would, under those conditions, react and behave with one another. I'll leave it at that, although I will start next week by showing how that view of Hobbes is only, at best, partially correct. So anyway, have a wonderful weekend with your parents here, and I'll see you next week.